right. Thank you, Matthew. I'd like to welcome everybody today to the Southwest Agricultural Research and Extension Center. We're located in Glade Spring, Virginia. We're about 30 minutes from the Tennessee line. If you're familiar where Bristol is, we can be to Tennessee in about 30 minutes. We can be to North Carolina in about 45 minutes. And if we go north, we can be to Kentucky or West Virginia in a little over an hour. So we're pretty far down here in the southwest corner. Little bit of history on us. We've been in existence since about 1925, 26. The station operated on some leased land. And then in 1947, the current site that we're on now was purchased by the General Assembly. There was about 230 acres here at the time, but that was before Interstate 81 came through, actually. So once the interstate went through, it left us with about 210 acres. But we have predominantly been livestock, forage nutrition. That's pretty much our focus area. We had burley tobacco years ago, but we have since sort of transitioned out of the burley tobacco research after the buyout. If you were listening last week with Southern Piedmont and listening to Dr. David Reed talk, he explained a lot of that buyout scenario. The burley work that they have at Southern Piedmont now used to be here at Southwest years ago until that buyout. So as you can see from the map here, those 14 counties, if you look at the orange dot there to your left, that's where we're located in Washington County, Virginia. Of course, agriculture is our #1 commodity here in Washington County. It is in Southwest Virginia and the Commonwealth as a whole. But those 14 counties west of Blacksburg in this Southwest area, if you look at those numbers, we've got a little over 450,000 cows and calves, excuse me, which is about 32% of what's in state. We've got a little over 30,000 ewes and lambs, which represents about 42% of the ewe and lamb population in the state. So as you can see from the picture there to your left, we've got rolling hills, topography, limestone soils. We've got a lot of rock outcropping. We don't have a whole lot of cropland in our area, but we're very well suited to livestock production and livestock research here at our center. Just talking a little bit about the sheep production, you see here, the hair sheep inventory in our end of the state has more than tripled since 2005. And I'll get into some of that, some of the justification and reasoning why that took place. And that was about the time that tobacco buyout hit. And most of our small farmers that had burley tobacco during that time had transitioned and either increased their cow numbers or actually went into hair sheep production. This is just a Google map of the center or the station. So there toward the bottom or the south end, you can see Interstate 81. We parallel that interstate, that whole section. On the north side is Norfolk Southern Railroad. So we've got interstate on one side, railroad on the other. To the far left, out of the screen is actually Emory and Henry College, small private college down our way. We've only got one small tract of land that separates the research center and Emory and Henry College. So we're kind of landlocked here. We don't have a whole lot of room for expansion. But this just kind of gives you a general idea. Patrick Henry High School, if you're familiar with that, is right across the road in that upper left-hand corner. And where we've got alfalfa hay and corn plots, that's pretty much the majority of our cropland over there that borders that railroad track. So we don't have a whole lot of flat ground. Everything else is pretty much rolling hills and pasture and some hayland. So a little bit about Southwest AREC. Myself, superintendent here. We've got one livestock and unit support person, which she takes care of administrative assistant duties in the office, but she's also part-time outside. She does a great job for us. She's actually got a degree in animal science from Tech. We've got 2 ag technicians here, one with a degree in crop and soil environmental science, and another technician who's been here for 43 years. All of us are well over 20 years experience. So we've got a very experienced staff, work well together, good team atmosphere down here. And as far as, other Other entities that we work with for our research programs, of course, in cows, we've got School of Animal Sciences, School of Plant and Environmental Sciences. We've done work over the years with the vet school, with our beef, cattle, and sheep projects both. We've done some work with other ARECs. We've got a great support group of county extension agents down here. We'll talk a little bit more about their stuff here shortly, but these guys do a great job. Phil Blevins, who's pictured in this bottom right-hand corner, Phil's been a county extension agent here in Washington County for well over 30 years, and he does a great job with programs he's got here. The Virginia State Small Farm Outreach, there's a new person, Miss Mandy Fletcher from Abingdon, who handles that for this end of the state, and we've done several programs with them over the past few years since they started that program. We've worked closely with USDA, West Virginia University, and North Carolina State University. We've got some collaborative projects going on with them, and it's all predominantly with the sheep work. That this presentation will get a little heavy focused on the sheep work here shortly, but you'll understand why as we go through. As far as research and extension working together, of course, you know, our typical field days, we actually had our forage and corn silage field day last night. We had well over 150 people here in attendance yesterday evening, even with it being 95 degrees. So we had a great event. Our annual sheep field day and ram sale will be September 20th of this year. So it's just a few weeks away. Our rams just came off test this week. So we'll be working with the vet school, getting breed soundness exams done on those next week and prepping for our sale. We've done a lot of beef outreach programs over the years with those county agents, the Virginia Quality Assurance Program, the Virginia Premium Assured Heifer programs. We've done a lot of work to coordinate some of those research efforts and help with extension and planning over the years. I'm a firm believer in the youth, our 4-H and FFA programs and our local, especially the county, here in Washington County. We do a lot of work with them, whether it's plants, soils, livestock. You can see Matthew Miller there in the upper right-hand corner. We actually had a day where we were teaching some kids how to show, doing some livestock judging events, things like that. We try and sponsor at least a couple of youth events, whether it's soils judging with FFA or NRCS sponsored events, things like that, a couple of times a year, if at all possible. We've hosted the grazing school here numerous times, working with NRCS and our local soil and water conservation districts. Extension and other ARECs are always involved with that as well. The state and regional corn silage plots, we house those here. The agents and some specialists from School of Plant Sciences work on those, as well as some seed companies and ag supply vendors always jump in and participate and help out with those as well. And again, our county agents, we do a lot of forage work down here. If you look at that lower left-hand picture, that Wintersteiger harvester, that piece of equipment was purchased a few years ago with some grant money from the Tobacco Commission, but the Ag and Feeder Cattle Association and several other ag vendors and ag lenders in our area put up quite a bit of money to buy that few $100,000 piece of equipment there, and it has been a tremendous asset to our forage program here at the center. Speaking of forage and livestock, since we're not too conducive to much row crop work, you know, this is pretty much where our focus has been over many years. Of course, we're right in the middle of the fescue belt. We know Kentucky 31 end-of-fight infected fescue can be a huge problem for beef cattle. So we've done a lot of fescue work over the years, as long as I've been here, and I've been here since the late 90s. So even working with Dr. Joe Fontenot way back when. I don't know if there's anybody on here that even remembers that name, but we've done a lot of work with the beef cattle program, with stocker calves, looking at reproductive effects on young heifers, doing heifer development work that has kind of been a staple over the years. Our hair sheep management, and again, we'll get a little more in depth on the hair sheep side of things here shortly, but you know, looking at growth, maternal traits, parasite resistance, carcass merit. I mean, we've done it from start to finish since about 1999 doing hair sheep research. In our ram tests, we started it in 2012. We'll get a little more detail on it shortly, but it has been kind of the feather in our cap here at the center and really gone much further than we ever thought it could. Graduate student involvement, we've consistently had pretty steady flow of graduate students coming through here, especially with the hair sheep side of things. Since the early 2000s, the beef cattle work, we've had students more off and on with our beef programs over the years, but we've really had a steady flow of grad students coming through with our hair sheep projects, whether they be through Virginia Tech or NC State or West Virginia, as we'll talk about here in a little bit. So as far as the hair sheep goes, Dr. Dave Nodder worked here with wool sheep and crossbred sheep for as long as the station had been in existence. There's always been sheep, beef cattle, and burley tobacco since the beginning until the tobacco sort of phased out there in the early 2000s. At that time, Scott County Hair Sheep Association was formed, which is a neighboring county. Hair sheep sort of were gaining in popularity. People couldn't find sheep shearers anymore. So the wool sheep were just sort of going by the wayside, unfortunately. So we needed to find a way to, implement some more livestock strategies. People wanted to diversify a little bit, in addition to some of the beef cattle herds that were here. So we brought in some of the first Katahdins, which is the breed of sheep we have here now. It's one of the few that's actually developed in the United States. It's a composite breed, but it's got more hair sheep influence than wool sheep influence. So when we brought those sheep in 1999, we're looking at ewe lambs. We evaluated their growth, their parasite resistance. We compared them to another hair sheep breed, which is a Dorper. We did some Dorper cross work. Dorpers were really expensive at the time. People kind of thought Dorpers were going to be the next up and coming thing, but they really didn't pan out to be as good as folks thought they were going to be. Not here in a pasture-based setting anyway. We also took a lot of these weather lambs. We evaluated their growth, parasite resistance as well. Took them all the way with, doing some work with the meats lab there on campus, looking at carcass data, and comparing all of that information as well as consumer attributes. We even did some taste panel work in some of those early years of production. So just a little bit of background on sheep, if you're not that familiar with them. Enemy number one, if you're a sheep producer, is Haemonchus contortus, or better known as the barber poleworm. So if you look at picture here on the right, that's the inside of an abomasum of a sheep. And those barber poleworms, what they do is attach themselves to the lining of that gut, and they'll start sucking the blood out of those animals, causing anemia. They'll start losing weight. They'll get very weak. Over time, they're going to die if they're not treated. But the biggest problem with this barber poleworm is the drugs that we can use, the dewormers, they can become resistant to those dewormers in a generation or two very quickly. So overuse of dewormers over time, it's called a significant increase in resistance in these animals. So what we have done with our work since then is sort of progress into looking at the genetics of these animals and find out how we can find more parasite resistance, natural resistance to these worms. And it's this worm specifically. I mean, they'll pick up other parasites, but this one is the deal breaker with sheep. If you're going to stay in the sheep business, you've got to be able to manage that worm. So just a little bit of background information. Again, I'll go through some of these slides fairly quickly, but looking at wool breeds, pretty much you're either looking at wool production or meat production. With the hair breeds of sheep, the claims of parasite resistance, this one pictured here on the right is a St. Croix. They're native to the Caribbean. That's where the parasite resistance comes from in sheep. If you've got a St. Croix influence in that animal, you will have some level of parasite resistance. It's just a matter of how much. But a straight St. Croix breed will offer outstanding parasite resistance. The downside is, if you look at that animal, they're a little thin muscled, they're finer boned, they don't do nearly as well from carcass merit standpoint. They don't stack up near as well on the rail. So that's one of your trade-offs, but they are prolific and they do offer parasite resistance. So with the Katahdin breed, I'll give you a little bit of history on those and what they are. A moderate frame sheep, probably 125 to 185 pound range. That's like a minimum and a maximum for a mature ewe. There's no color requirements. They do shed. The ewe pictured here on your left is actually a ewe that's midway through her shedding cycle in the spring. The rest of that fluffy winter coat's going to eventually fall off for the summer months. You know, the good thing about these, they were coined as easy care sheep with parasite resistance. You don't have to dock tails. You don't have to castrate, depending on what your market setting is. Very prolific animals. So of course, when they're coined as easy care, producers want to jump on that real quick. So that's part of what we were trying to do, was determine, are they really as easy care as what the breed industry wants to make them out to be? So when I say prolificacy, and you look at, you know, percent lamb crop, the Katahdin breed actually has about a 200% lamb crop among registered flocks of that data that's being collected. So basically a 210% lamb crop is about 2.1 lambs. The U.S. wool sheep industry averages about 120% lamb crop. So you're looking at 2 lambs versus 1 lamb. You can double your profit based on the number of head if you can keep them alive. So of course, that's definitely an interest for most producers. If you have more lambs on the ground and can keep them alive, that's definitely going to affect your bottom line. Katahdins are very hardy. You know, they're raised from northern Alberta, Canada, all the way to Colombia, Ecuador, Puerto Rico. And most folks do consider these a maternal breed. Some of the early work, this just kind of gives you an idea. And again, I'm going to zip through some of these slides fairly quickly. The early work in the early 2000s, where we compared the Katahdins to the Dorset crosses and the Dorper crosses. Anywhere you see a slide that has FEC represented, that's fecal egg count, and that's how we measure the actual parasite resistance in these animals, is periodically, whether it's weekly or bi-weekly, looking at those actual fecal egg count numbers. So we're looking at the number of barber pole worm eggs in the fecal matter. We also do some packed cell volume work, taking blood samples, comparing protein levels in those bloods to our blood to the fecal egg count levels that we see. A lot of that early work that we did with Katahdins and, you know, the straight hair sheep, more of the St. Croix influence versus the wool cross sheep. You know, we were really trying to identify just how resistant these animals were, and we were kind of feeling our way through to see, you know, how do these worms impact these sheep? How do the sheep stand up to them? You know, and of course, the bottom slides there, when you start looking at carcass traits, Katahdins and the hair sheep crosses did not do quite as well on some of those retail cuts or carcass weights. But on the upper side, when you start looking at those fecal egg count values, the Katahdins with the yellow bar and the hair cross sheep and the orange bars did much better in offering parasite resistance and staying alive ultimately. We also looked at the ewe or the female evaluation of these ewes through these early years. Ewe age, how long they stayed in the flock, how long they were productive. You know, just looking at this bottom slide here and looking at the average over a 5-year term, you know, Katahdins, the percent remaining within the flock that were productive females over that first 5-year study, they were very prolific and they hung around, they lasted. You know, we didn't have to cull for many reasons at all. Those girls were just very hardy, had a lot of longevity to offer, and I think that's part of the reason they caught on in our end of the state. So from 2006 to 2015, we really started focusing more on the parasite management and looking at the genetic components of this animal. I mentioned Dr. Notter's name earlier. You know, he developed and managed the National Sheep Improvement Program, the database that was managed for that with all flocks in the U.S. was actually managed there on campus at Virginia Tech for years while he was there. Did an outstanding job. You know, looking at the fecal egg counts, those pack cell volumes, FOMACHA scores, looking at eyelids to sort of determine how parasitic some of these sheep may be. You know, looking at interactions between genetics and management systems, whether we had them on dry lot feeding them, whether they were in solely a pasture-based system or a pasture-based system with some supplement. We did all kinds of different things to kind of see what kind of effects management might have in relation to the genetics of these animals and how they reacted to these parasites. So a lot of that work was used, and Dr. Notter used it to develop his his coefficients and formulations that he put into that NSIP database to offer breeding values or estimated breeding values in sheep or similar to EPDs in cattle. So we were able to do that. We actually developed a parasite resistance or a fecal egg count breeding value for the Katahdin breed. It was the first of its kind out there. So since that time to now, the Katahdin breed has actually become a leader in enrollments in National Sheep Improvement Program from producers to animals. So that flock data submission, it's just become unreal that the thousands and thousands of animals that are in that database right now. Katahdin's caught on with a lot of young producers, a lot of very proactive producers have jumped in and really this breed has done more expansion in the U.S. in the last 10 to 15 years than any other breed. Our forage-based ram test system that we put in place in 2012, ultimately what we did, people were trying to find breeding rams. How can we find rams that are going to offer parasite resistance, offer growth? One thing we found in our early research was there's definitely an antagonistic effect between post-weaning growth and parasite resistance. The more parasite resistant the animal is, the slower they grow. It's almost like they're using their energy reserves to fight off parasites rather than grow. So we do know that adverse correlation was there. It always has been. So what we did was develop a ram test. We used the ram test from Shenandoah Valley kind of as a model. It had been in place for years, but the way we tweaked it, that typical ram test or bull test setting, it's kind of an ad lib feed, see who grows the most and the fastest, and measure some genetic components, and we'll rank them from there and put them in a sale. So what we did with this ram test, we wanted to leave them in a forage-based setting so they continue to pick up more worm larvae, so we can measure that parasite resistance, and we actually give those animals a dose of 5,000 worm larvae to start the test, and then monitor them every week or bi-weekly with FOMACHA scores, fecal egg counts, and weigh days to measure their growth rates as well as their parasite resistance or susceptibility. So again, we've been doing this. We narrow that age window down. Rams that are born anywhere from January 15th to March 15th of that year are the ones that can be nominated and come in here for a test. We accept these rams from anywhere in the country. We bring them in, put them through after delivery day, they go through a quarantine phase for a few weeks. We get them acclimated to our surroundings here, and then we kick them out on pasture with a load of worms, and we leave them out there for 70 days and keep track of how they do. Our sale has consistently been one of the top sales in the country for Katahdin rams. We only sell the top 50% of those rams based on their test data. So, it has really become the go-to place. And just to give you an idea of what we look for with those fecal egg count observations, this is a typical observation for a ram. When you start the test at day 0, they all pretty much have no worms in their system except for what we give them. 2 weeks later, 2 to 3 weeks later, you're going to see that spike and elevation in that worm count because the worm larvae that we gave them have become adults. They've started to reproduce, lay those eggs. You can see this curve sort of naturally peak and come down, and that sort of gives us an idea of how resistant this animal is to the worms that we gave them or the worms they continue to pick up on pasture. So this graph pretty much represents that green line is Ram A. That's typically what we see in most Katahdins. They'll spike fairly high. They'll drop back on their own. That's what you want to see. The blue line Ram offers exceptional parasite resistance from what we've seen over the years. Most of those worm larvae that we give him may not even reach adulthood, which is kind of the mechanism for parasite resistance with that St. Croix breed. That line drops back down to a 0, and they pretty much don't harbor any more worms for the duration of the test. The red line ram pretty much offers no resistance whatsoever. He's completely susceptible to the worms, and those are definitely going to be excluded from, probably end up having to be dewormed off test, and will definitely not make it into our sale program. This just kind of gives you an idea. some of the costs of what's associated with the test, the bottom line with the sale results, that just gives you an idea. These are sale averages. So, last year the sale average was $1,665. That was on 49 Rams that we sold. So pretty good average. I think we had a range last year. Our high selling Ram was a little over $5,000 and they went down to 500. So, but pretty big gap, but at the same time, folks know what they're getting. We have a lot of data to offer these folks when they come in to buy Rams. And the participating breeders and the Rams sold, if you look at the very bottom of this screen, I think there's 17 states represented here that either have consigners or producers that have brought Rams to this test. And the Rams that have sold and gone out of here, we've got some that have gone to Minnesota, Texas, Wisconsin, and definitely all of the southeastern and mid-Atlantic states are represented either with consigners or buyers. So moving on from the Ram test, we tried a terminal sire project 2015 to 2017. If anybody's familiar with Dr. Andrew Weaver now, this was actually his master's degree project while he was on campus at Tech. We had a good core group of Katahdin ewes, and we were just wondering, okay, so what happens if you crossbreed these girls? Are you going to negate some of our parasite resistance effects, or can we improve some carcass merit with these? So basically what we did is take a third of the flock, we bred them back to a Katahdin Ram to continue with our purebreds. We bred a third of them to a Suffolk Ram, a wool breed, and a third to a wool breed Texel Ram. So just to give you an idea how you can increase carcass merit just in one generation with a crossbred effect, the Katahdin carcass here on the left, the Suffolk cross in the center, and the Texel carcass on the right. Just looking at loin eye area and looking at leg scores, you can see a vast improvement. But you got to remember, these are still half-bred or half-blood Katahdins. So just that one generation by using a terminal sire definitely improved our carcass merit, retail cuts, dressing percentage on those carcasses. So in a commercial setting, if you've got a flock of Katahdin ewes that have outstanding parasite resistance, they're good maternal traits with over a 200% lamb crop, you can put a terminal sire on them and also gain the benefits of more meat, selling those animals by the pound for meat production. One interesting fact that we saw when we started looking at fecal egg counts, the bottom slide to your left, we did notice that the Texel breed, or Texel cross, actually offered a little bit more parasite resistance. And what that slide shows is how high the infective level of parasites had to be before those animals required deworming, whether they started losing body condition or showed signs of anemia. That Suffolk cross breed had to be dewormed at a much earlier stage. They could not handle near the parasite burden as the Texel or the Katahdin lambs. So that was an interesting fact. This just gives you kind of a scaled picture of the Texel sire on the left, Suffolk cross sire on the right, and the full-blood Katahdin in the center. So from that carcass merit standpoint, you can definitely see what you can gain with one generation of a terminal sire cross versus a purebred Katahdin. So what did we decide to do after that? We had a crazy idea with Dr. Scott Bowdridge up at West Virginia, and Dr. Weaver, who was here doing that master's degree project, actually moved on to work under Dr. Bowdridge at West Virginia for his PhD. So we actually decided to divergently mate the flock we had here based on our breeding values, extremely high fecal egg count values versus extremely low. So just as a reminder, low fecal egg counts are good. Negative numbers are good. That means you have more parasite resistance. The high fecal egg counts are not so great. You have extreme susceptibility. So we began to start breeding these. And at the time, USDA was starting to look at doing some genomics work and seeing if they could do some gene mapping for sheep. And they actually chose the Katahdin breed because we had so much interest and so much data behind it. And we were able to work with the USDA Center in Boonville, Arkansas, and some folks out in Nebraska at Clay Center, Meat Animal Research Center out there to do some comparative effects with our flock here. This just kind of gives you an idea of, and this was back in 2019, but this is a percentile ranking report for the Katahdin breed. Those weaning fecal egg count values and post-weaning fecal egg count values at the top, -100 is the best in the breed. But if you look at the very bottom, the worst in the breed with data collected on it was actually a plus 1,832. Extremely susceptible to parasites. And that let us know there's a huge range in parasite resistance and susceptibility within this breed. So we actually decided, okay, well, we know -51 is kind of breed average, but we've got some outliers that are extremely bad, some outliers that are extremely good. So how do we need to focus our research efforts? We want to identify those lambs that are extremely resistant to parasites, as well as the ones that are extremely susceptible. And maybe it would help us to identify and map that genome a little bit more accurately if we could parse out some of those DNA markers as best we could. So here's just kind of a representative effect of what we did with our low sires. You see we did have a -100 and -99. We went out and tried to find the best we could, and we also went out and tried to find the worst we could. If you see that plus 335, that's the high sire average. Those are the highest ones we could find, probably because they were the only ones still alive when we were looking for breeding sires to do this crazy project. So the effects on those lambs, here are the breeding values of what we ended up with the low breeding values versus high breeding values. And just to give you an idea, by sire, we could parse those out and see how many of those lambs or which sire had the best effect or the worst effect from parasite resistance. And here's a similar line to what I showed from the ram test a while ago. That low fecal egg count sire, when they go through the stress of weaning, they pick up worms, they pick up larvae naturally on pasture. They spike during that stress period of weaning. They'll top out, and the low fecal egg count lambs, based on their breeding values, tended to do exactly what we expected them to. They came back down on their own. They managed those parasites, got back in check and did just fine. The high fecal egg count lambs, they got stressed, they spiked, and they continued to rise. They had to be dewormed. Most of those low fecal egg count lambs did not even require a dewormer. Most of them were genetically superior and could handle that worm burden on their own. And this is just shows you the same trend, but by sire rather than an entire group of low versus high. So we could definitely see the effects by sire. Some are better than others for both high and low. One thing that really jumped out at us in the early years of doing this project, death loss. I mean, if you're in the sheep business, in a commercial standpoint, somewhere between 5 and a 10% death loss is not unexpected. It's kind of a normal thing. You're going to lose lambs, whether it be to predators like coyotes, neighbors' dogs, or whether it be to barber pole worm, or any other problem. What we did not expect to see in year one, we had close to a 30% death loss in the high fecal egg count sired lambs. It was not specifically to parasites. And this is the one thing that really jumped out at us all. We actually had a Clostridial perfringens type A outbreak in this flock of sheep. We'd never seen type A here before, but it was a bad year for it. Our local vets had seen some in cattle and goats and sheep just on our end of the state, and we happened to end up with it here. And a 30% death loss just blew us away. We have never experienced anything like that before. But with necropsies that were done, we did determine the majority of that death loss was to that type A outbreak. In year two, we were able to get a vaccine for that type A. This pretty much brought things back into check as to what we were expecting to see. So when we vaccinated for that type A Clostridial disease, we were able to negate the effects of death loss to that, pretty much kept it in check to just general health and routine management issues that we would see, or parasite loss. So again, not really much effect on that low fecal egg count lamb, but a huge effect on the high fecal egg count lamb, which made us think, what else might be going on here? Do we have an immune function response? Even though we've been selecting for parasites pretty much solely all these years, looking for parasite resistance, have we ultimately been selecting for something else? So we went back and started digging through past records of lambs, ewes, everything we had on the place. Well, sure enough, records that we were treating for foot scald problems, in our lambs. There's about a 10% difference in that. Those high fecal egg count breeding value lambs had about a 10% higher incidence of a foot problem. And we sorted that out by sire in this group of animals that we could identify. And sure enough, the high fecal egg count sires tended to be worse on foot issues. So we started digging even further back and looked at our ewe flock here at the station. We've been keeping these breeding value records for years, even as far back with Dr. Notter, and starting in about 2005, we had EBVs on these animals. So we went back over a short-term duration at that time frame, and we found that based on mastitis and udder problems with our ewe flock, ultimately 12% of the ewes that we had culled over the years were high fecal egg count ewes, but they tended to have more udder problems and mastitis problems or bacterial infections. The low fecal egg count ewes that had mastitis over that duration of time we looked at, only 2% of those had ultimately been culled for a mastitis issue. So again, when we're looking at immune function, with everything we had been doing, we thought, okay, well, we're ultimately selecting for more than just parasite resistance, but what are we looking for? What other outcomes could come of this, and why? So of course, we started looking, immediately went to that clostridial problem we had. We vaccinate for types C and D every year, but we had never vaccinated for type A up until then. So we thought, okay, well, what kind of antibody response do we have to a vaccine? Do these sheep with a lower fecal egg count value EBV, do they generate more antibody? Is this why they're healthier? We don't know. So we specifically started to target the IgG antibody. Dr. Bowdridge at West Virginia and his immunology lab had been doing quite a bit of work studying IgG levels for different things, but this flock of sheep just lended itself exactly to what he was looking for and what he needed. So we immediately changed gears and started looking at different ideas of how we may identify these antibody levels within these sheep. So again, we did the same mating scenario, the low fecal egg count ewes to the low rams, the high ewes to the high rams, to continue that divergent mating. And to check the vaccination status or that antibody level, basically at week 0 represents weaning. We did our typical fecal egg counts to measure that parasite resistance. We started taking blood samples on a weekly basis. You had that initial vaccine at week 0, your booster at week 4. So with all this data, we continued to collect over time. The fecal egg count values were exactly what we thought they would be. The lows continued to stay low. They offered more parasite resistance. The highs did not. And as you can see from the graph, the same stress period, the same trend in the curve that on these others. But when you start looking at that IgG level and antibody response to these vaccines, this kind of really tells a huge story. So if you look at week 2 after that initial vaccine, the solid black dots are the low fecal egg count lambs, the parasite resistant ones, and the open centered dot is your high fecal egg count or parasite susceptible lambs. So at week 2 with that initial antibody response, the low fecal egg count lambs or parasite resistant lambs had about double the antibody level in their immune system. If you go to week 4, we gave them that booster shot. 2 weeks later, if you look again, the antibody level in the parasite resistant sheep was almost double again. So even with that booster vaccine, the antibody levels continued to rise. So those animals we found over time just continue to be healthier and have more of an immune function response to about anything we've thrown at them. So again, going back to that 30% death loss year, which was 2018, if you look over time from 2018, and we actually just parsed out here at 2020, 2021, and 2022, looking at the death loss with this divergent mating scheme. The high fecal egg count group was about a 16% death loss. The low fecal egg count group was an 8% death loss. So we cut that death loss in half, just by trying to parse these animals out and seeing who's more susceptible and who's more resistant to what. It's not just worms. So we bounced after the vaccination project. We started looking at colostrum in milk, and I'll zip through some of these. But looking at colostrum, the first year we looked at milk at mid lactation and late lactation in addition to colostrum, but we found out the trend stayed the same. So we really focused on the colostrum because we got a lot more information out of that. Again, what does colostrum offer to a newborn lamb, a newborn calf, any infant? Of course, nutrition, proteins, vitamins, but the passive immunity and the IgG specifically is what we targeted. Same scenario from a breeding standpoint. We had the extremely resistant at -50, extremely susceptible at a +50, and we did have a group of everything that fell in between. So here are the IgG measurements in that colostrum, and this colostrum was collected on all lambs in this group of about 150 ewes that we lambed out. So we had well over 200 lambs that we collected samples on, or ewes that we collected samples on for 200 lambs. This just shows that IgG measurement in that colostrum that was predominantly collected within the first 10 hours after birth. And looking at the low fecal egg count ewes, their IgG levels in their colostrum was double what the middle group was and more than double what the susceptible group is. So this just told us those lambs coming out of low fecal egg count ewes are getting much more antibodies in their colostrum at birth, which probably tends to lead to why they stay healthier throughout the course of time over their lifetime. And looking at colostrum samples, this is the low fecal egg count group with a green top. It is a thick, almost like melted butter type colostrum. Cow's milk on the right. Everybody's familiar with cow's milk. And just as a source of reference, the high fecal egg count girls, their colostrum was much more like milk rather than that thick, pasty, buttery type colostrum that they got out of the parasite resistant ewes. So again, what have we found over time? Parasite resistant lambs, we're reducing death loss to weaning and after. We have much greater lamb survivability, lower mastitis incidence in our brood ewes, greater ewe longevity to stay in the flock, greater antibody response to these clostridial vaccines, and a much higher IgG production, which ultimately leads to lambs living longer. So when we look at why does all this matter, research in all livestock species is focused on how to find and select animals with improved immunity. We think we have stumbled upon that in sheep. We're going to continue to do the research that we're doing. But with the selection criteria we've done over the years, we may be onto something here. So our next focus, and I'm just going to wrap things up here, Matthew. We've introduced some smart farming technology, another project that we're doing in cooperation with NC State and Dr. Weaver down there. We've put some grow safe feed nodes in. We're evaluating the impact of this divergent mating selection that we've been doing on nutritional behavior, feeding efficiency, and looking at residual feed intakes on these animals that we're measuring on the grow safe feed system. This grow safe feed system kind of works like this. We had to modify it to work with sheep. It's designed for cattle with a big bunk. So we had to make these small feeders to go in for the sheep. But ultimately what happens, the sheep can come in, they eat out of the feeder. They've got an electronic ID tag in that tells us exactly how much they eat. Comes back to a computer here at the office, all of it saved in the cloud. And we're monitoring daily intake for the feed that goes in. feeding, looking at feed efficiency, meal duration, times of feeding. I mean, there's just so much information we can get out of this that's just leading us in a whole different direction. If we can figure things out here, then of course we've got to go look and see how it works on pasture or in a pasture setting. That's going to be the tricky part. But this is just where we are with some of the technology and the smart farm stuff that we have here. We also have a portable C-lock feeder that can measure feed intake on animals on pasture. So we've got some new technology here that we're starting to use, and I will wrap it up there.
All right. Thank you very much, Lee. We appreciate it. While other people might be thinking of questions, and for those of you who have questions, you're welcome to unmute and ask them as you would like to or need to. I do have one question, kind of as a plant guy from the eastern part of the state. And that would be, as far as the prevalence of the parasites, is there a gradient across the state? Are they worse in the western part of the state, eastern part of the state? Does it matter?
If you have sheep, you have that parasite.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not as, probably not as bad in the western range flocks, and like the upper Midwest is going to have a shorter duration. You know, those summer months, hot, humid weather, these parasites thrive in. Once the temperature drops to a certain degree, they're going to burrow down into the ground. They're going to stay there till next year. They can go to a hyperbolic state. They can go dormant at any time they want to and break dormancy during the summer months and come back. So, you know, typical scenario this year when it got dry and we had those drought conditions, in a lot of cases, those worms may have gone, or the larvae may have gone dormant because it was hot and dry. Soon as we had a rain, they got some moisture, those larvae will work their way up that blade of grass. So as those sheep go along and eat it, they'll pick them up that way. So yeah, hot, humid conditions, they thrive.
Gotcha. All right. Do we have any other questions? We got a quiet group this week.
Put everybody to sleep. Nobody wanted to hear about sheep.
I found it fascinating. I think, you know, that this is a prime example of applied research and how it leads, you kind of go down a rabbit hole.
That's the thing, you know, we've done cattle work here for years, not that don't want to do cattle work. You know, being a smaller station, smaller paddock size, you know, we can do sheep much more efficiently. We can get more animal units, and of course, more animal units means better accuracy in your data collection. So it's not the fact that we want to solely do sheep, it's just the information we've been finding has just leapfrogged into the next generation of a research project. It's done really well. And the folks we're working with, Dr. Weaver and Dr. Bowdridge, have a great interest in it. And it's just been a great working relationship with those other two universities as well.
I've got a question.
Sure.
I was just wondering, has anybody looked, sorry, the camera's not quite on me. Has anybody looked at pre-breeding, like reproductive characteristics, with females that are considered, you know, resistant or low, you know, low, what you were calling low, I guess, load or population? Has anybody looked at how well they breed compared to ones that are less parasite resistant?
As a ewe lamb or as a first time breeder, is that what you mean?
Yes.
Or just the longevity over the lifespan of that?
I guess both would be interesting to know, kind of their longevity in the herd versus, yeah.
Yes, I know we've analyzed some of that data with our flock here. Probably not as much as we should have, but I think you're gonna see the trend of the parasite resistant ewes with the longevity that we've seen in them over time. They tend to stay in the flock a lot longer. They get culled at a much lower rate. So if you look at them trying to compare them from year to year, I think over time, you're going to have that natural effect. As far as, you know, prolificacy, I don't really see a lot of difference there. I think the susceptible ewes are probably just as prolific and tend to consistently have twins for us like the resistant ones do. I don't think there's a huge effect there, but over time, I think you're going to see the lower fecal egg count used be a little more productive in their lifetime.
Thanks. And actually, next week we'll be out there for the BSCs. So I actually want to talk to you about a couple ideas I might have. So remind me.
Oh, I just realized who's talking. Yeah, I'll see you next Wednesday.
All right. Do we have any other questions? Fantastic. Okay. Well, I don't hear any other questions. If you do, feel free to cut me off. You're not going to hurt my feelings. I did have a couple of announcements. First thing I wanted to do is Lee, thank you so much for sharing more information about the AREC out there. It's fascinating work you're doing and very beneficial to the producers in the area across the state, as a matter of fact. So kudos to you. Just a couple of announcements. The next seminar we will have will be on September 27th, which is the last Friday in September. We're going to be featuring the Eastern Virginia AREC. So we're going to swing about as far as you can get east. Joseph Oakes is the superintendent there, and Joseph is actually on here now. I'm going to go ahead and also announce that the Eastern Virginia AREC, which is Joseph's AREC as well, is going to have their soybean field day on September 12th. I don't mean to put you on the spot, Joseph, but if you're there and you can chime in, you might want to give a plug for that. I'll give you a minute to do that if you'd like.
Yeah, I can. Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, it's going to be on September 12th. We're going to start about 9 that morning and go through lunchtime. Lunch will be provided. We're going to have several extension specialists featured, Dr. Kerry Ortell, Dr. David Langston, and then our soybean breeder on campus, Dr. Bo Zhang, and then some other work being going on with biosolids work and things like that. And so soybeans, yeah, we'll be featuring that as well. So look forward to seeing as many of you as can to come out. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Joseph. One other event to announce is the day before that, on September 11th, we will have the Peanut Variety Quality Evaluation, or PVQE field day. It's actually in North Carolina, even though it's a Virginia event. It's in Williamston, North Carolina. For both of those, the soybean field day with Joseph, as well as the PVQE field day, you're welcome to look at the Eastern Virginia AREC Facebook page, as well as the Tidewater AREC Facebook page. If you'd like to register or find out more information, you could also call Joseph for the soybean day, or you're welcome to contact me, Matthew Chappell, for the peanut field day as well. So with that, unless anyone else has any other questions, I am going to go ahead and close down the meeting. Thank you so much for attending, and we hope you have a great holiday weekend.